what about gain staging in the DAW? What happens after you've recorded it correctly? You left enough headroom, you didn't clip the converter, you didn't go above 0. What can go wrong now? What you have to watch out for? This is the Self-Recording Band Podcast, the show where we help you make exciting records on your own, wherever you are, DIY style. Let's go. Hello and welcome to the Self-Recording Band Podcast. I am your host, Benedict Hein, and I'm here with my friend and co-host, Malcolm Owen Flood. How are you, Malcolm?
Hello, I'm good. And how are you today?
I'm doing fantastic, thank you. I had a recording session this week. We've been talking about that just before we hit record on this episode. And I kind of enjoyed it, very much so, actually. I'm not doing as many recording sessions these days, but it was really fun to be in the studio with a band again and like doing it all from scratch, creating things together rather than just dealing with what's already there. And it was just a fun and fun experience, fun thing to do. And it made me think that I should do that every once in a while, maybe.
Yeah, get back to the roots.
yeah, exactly. And I also feel like that the more practice you have mixing and doing other things, if you go back to recording, then things make so much more sense in a way, or you just approach it differently. Like one is good for the other, basically. I don't know. If you want to be a good mixer, you should have recorded, I think, some stuff. And if you want to get better at recording, you should at least try to balance and mix stuff so you know what your decisions do to the thing and to the end result. So anyway, it's just I felt like that I actually got better as a producer and recording engineer, much better through mixing. So, yeah.
You kind of figure out what you like and you don't like and how things affect what you're trying to do later on. It definitely all adds up for sure.
Yeah.
I try and give feedback to people that send me tracks because of that. You know, if they're self-recording and they send me something to mix, I try and offer some feedback so that the next song might be a little closer in the direction they're aiming.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. Absolutely. So before we dive into today's episode, I want to let you know that we have a free download for you. It's called the 10-Step Guide to Successful DIY Recording. And if you want to have that, go to the selfrecordingband.com/10-step guide. It's a little mini ebook type of thing, a long PDF. It has the whole process of like pre-production, writing, arrangement even, setup, recording, gear, all that stuff, all the way to the finished thing. So it's a great starting point. It's a great overview of the whole process. It's completely free, and you can download it by going to the selfrecordingband.com/10-step guide. That's just something I frequently forget to say, so I want to send you there. Today's episode is basically on the topic that we've been talking about, on recording, and on like the back to the roots topic, because it's one of the most basic things, but one of the most important things to know. It's super crucial. It's not everyone's favorite topic. It's not the sexiest thing to talk about, but it's very, very important. And we're going to talk about gain staging and getting your levels right at the various stages of making a record. So what is gain staging actually? What do we mean by that term, Malcolm?
So on all of your devices, like your interface, your preamps and such, there is usually a gain knob. And believe it or not, that is there for a reason. And you want to get it to a certain level. And inside of your DAW, there's faders, there's plugins, there's all of the stuff. And anytime you can see like a meter jumping, like right now, I can see my voice activating Pro Tools meter, and I'm just going past the bright green color. And that's there for a reason as well. So what we're talking about is where you want to get your gain. So how loud your signal is essentially is what we're measuring, and why that's important.
Yeah.
So really the main thing you need to know is that if you go too far, it can go bad. The worst thing that can pretty much come of this, and don't worry, it's pretty easy to get this right, but the worst thing is that you can cause some clipping in a certain stage, and we're going to talk about the other side of that because clipping can be good. But in most cases, or in the cases of what we're talking about right now, clipping sounds like unwanted distortion. I should almost turn up my mic preamp and clip it.
Yeah, do
so
it.
you can hear it.
Do it.
Okay, it's going to be loud for you.
Yeah.
Okay, I am talking. That sounds awful. So what if we recorded the whole podcast like this? Right? That'd be terrible. Okay. Yeah, so you can imagine if we didn't know what we were doing and we recorded the whole podcast like that, it would be bad news.
Yes.
And that has a huge effect on the audio quality. And not only that, it also has an effect on things that come later in the chain, because the signal, like the gain of my voice, is going to be fed into something else, maybe a compressor, right? And the volume that the compressor is receiving is going to change how it reacts. I mean, I'm kind of going too far. We got to slow down a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah, but you're totally right. Everything affects everything. Like the level you're starting with and you're sending to everything that follows affects everything. So, yeah. Just I mean, I don't think you're going too far. It went by saying that the compressor and everything reacts differently. Every piece of gear basically does sound different depending on the signal going in. Some gear can handle a wide range of different like levels without sounding too different. Other stuff sounds drastically different with lower or higher levels. So if you would have done what you just did with your preamp, if you would have done that with your 1073, that Malcolm, by the way, used for the first couple of episodes of this podcast, if I remember correctly, which is a super expensive, high-end piece of gear that you don't need to record a podcast, but Malcolm did because he can. And if you'd done that with that piece of gear, it would have sounded different than what you just did now. And different gear sounds different with different levels. So it's important to know that most of your, I think most of the typical interfaces and the typical gear you would use in a home recording scenario will sound pretty clean up to a certain point, and then it's going to start to distort, mostly in an unpleasant way. So you want to keep it clean, and that's basically it. But once you get into analog gear that has transformers in it, or tubes, or any sort of sonic quality, and not just clean representation of what you put in, it gets really interesting, and you got to be really careful because you will color the sound with the amount of gain you put in there.
Yes, which can be desired or not desired.
Yeah,
right.
Totally.
So let's stick with digital right now.
Okay.
Digital preamps, especially. We don't want to clip our converters on the way in usually, right? Like that's kind of what I just did. It sounded awful. Not desirable.
Yeah.
But that can also play a role inside your DAW, like when you're using plugins and stuff like that. You want to keep headroom, and headroom's a word we keep using, but that just essentially just means that you're not hitting zero. You're keeping it below that at a reasonable level. And it used to be that you needed to record hot enough. Like you couldn't be too quiet, because we should talk about signal to noise ratios a little bit.
Yeah.
There's noise, system noise, especially with like old amplifiers, you'll find they have a lot of noise, right?
Yeah.
So if your signal isn't loud enough compared to that operating noise, then you've got a problem, right? Like it's going to be hard to make it so the listener doesn't notice that noise. So you had to record a hot enough gain to avoid that noise floor. In the modern world that we're luckily in right now, that's really not an issue with most gear. The signal to noise ratio is so good that you can pretty well record as quiet as you want. Here, let's do one more test with my channel. Thomas, I'm going to turn down my mic to like its lowest setting and talk, and I want you to clip gain it up so that it's comparative, like a comparative volume to the rest of the podcast. And let's see if there's a noticeable noise floor change. There probably won't be, I bet.
That's cool.
All right. I am now talking as quiet as it goes, and we'll see if there's any noise because I can't hear it right now.
Cool.
Okay, I'm going back. But there probably won't be. It'll probably be fine. So in the modern gear, you can pretty well record as quiet as you want. And I would suggest people do play it a little safe and just avoid clipping their preamps. Would you agree with that, Benny?
Totally. If you record in 16-bit, in 24-bit, sorry.
Yes.
That's the thing you need to know, because that's also a very common question. Should I record in 16, 24, 32, whatever? So most interfaces can do 16 and 24, most converters. And you should always record in 24 because that's the main reason for this. In simple terms, with 24-bit, the dynamic range is much bigger, which means the difference between the quietest possible signal and the loudest possible signal without distorting is much bigger than the difference between those in a 16-bit signal. So with 16-bit, if we record the noise floor, the operating noise, will be significantly louder than with 24. So if you record quietly and you record in 16-bit and then you turn it up, what Malcolm just did in this example, if you did that with a 16-bit recording, the noise floor would be brought up as well, and it would be significantly louder, and you would probably hear it. With 24-bit, the noise floor is so super low down there because the dynamic range is so big that you can record super quiet signals without bringing up the noise too much. So 24-bit is the thing you need to do and the requirement for this, and every single interface basically these days can do that. So 24-bit, and then absolutely play it safe, unless you want the distortion, the sound of the distortion. But still, the level going into the DAW, you should play it safe and leave some headroom there, meaning like room between the loudest part of your signal and zero. Zero is digital zero. It's 0 dBFS. It's just the dB full scale. That's the point where a digital signal just clips no matter what. It's like a hard clip. It's like the ceiling. You can't go any further than that. It will clip. The thing is, we need to explain, as long as you're outside of the computer in the analog domain, as long as we're inside of the preamp before it hits the converter, as long as we are talking about analog processors, EQs, compressors, whatever, they don't have a hard ceiling like that. Every piece of gear has a different headroom, so some things will clip earlier, others will clip later, some will have a smoother curve, so they will start clipping gently, others will hard clip more. But every piece of gear is different, but there's technically there's no hard ceiling like 0 dB. But in digital, there is. So as soon as you go from the preamp and from everything that's happening before the converter of your interface, if you go from that to the converter, you need to stay below 0 to not make it clip. And that type of distortion that the converter makes when you clip it is usually the type that you don't want most of the time. So stay under 0 and leave some headroom just in case the signal gets louder. If you record a drum kit, for example, you never know how hard the drummer will hit the snare at some point in the song. Just leave a little more headroom. With a vocalist as well, you never know what the loudest thing in the song will be, and you don't want to, just leave enough headroom for those things to happen so that it doesn't clip. And if you want the sound of some analog gear or a preamp or whatever before the converter, then you need to find a way to crank the input and get the sound you want, and then dial back the output so that you don't clip the converter. Yes. That's what you need to do then in that case. Ideally, you have a preamp that has two controls, input and output, then that's easy. If you don't have that, you would have to use a pad or something in between the preamp and the converter, or you need to use a pad switch on the interface, something like that. But just make sure you pay attention to that, because in addition to the desired distortion of your gear, you might add the unwanted distortion from the converter.
To connect the dots a little, anybody that's used a guitar amp would probably have a guitar that's got a preamp and like a master volume. And that's kind of what we're talking about. You could crank the preamp and get distortion, but then turn it down with your master volume. And in this situation where we can't hit 0, we got to get the distortion we want, but not clip our converters. That's where an output or a output pad, it's different gear has different options there for sure.
Totally. And when I say converter, you don't need to have an extra piece of gear for that. Like if you have one of the common interfaces, they have a preamp and a converter built into one box. So people might get confused because they say, I don't have a preamp and I don't have a converter. Yes, you have, because you have an interface, and that interface has a built-in mic pre and a built-in converter. It's just in one box, but it's the same thing. And there is a signal chain going on in that interface. So you're hitting the analog mic pre, and that will send the pre-amplified signal to the built-in converter. So that's how it works.
And the converter is literally converting it from an analog to a digital signal.
Exactly.
It's a very literal word.
yes, totally. Yeah, and that's basically it. And the way to find out how your gear sounds is you can, by trying, of course, you can just try it, but also it's worth having a look at the manuals because gear is calibrated differently. And we don't need to go into the specifics here. We thought about giving you numbers and dB scales and stuff, but it's just too confusing. It's technical enough with this episode. Just look into the manuals, see what levels these pieces of gear are meant to be used with. Try to find a way to meter that if possible, if you're in the analog domain. If you're in the DAW, have a look at the manuals of your plugins, because the same thing is true for plugins that emulate analog gear. Have a look at the manuals there and make sure you're hitting your plugins correctly. So that's the next thing that we're going to talk about here. What about gain staging in the DAW? What happens after you've recorded it correctly? You left enough headroom, you didn't clip the converter, you didn't go above 0, you recorded it properly, and now you're in the DAW. What can go wrong now? What you have to watch out for?
Right. So the worst is past. The clipping on the way in is the most destructive thing you're going to run into. And the reason that is because most DAWs actually operate not at 24-bit, but actually at 32-bit float now, where it's pretty well impossible to really clip inside your DAW. But that doesn't mean that you can stop thinking about it. Certain plugins, a lot of plugins, are based on hardware. Like, you'll find a 1176 compressor plugin or a Neve channel strip or EQ or something like that. There's lots of stuff like that. Pretty well every DAW has some of that going on, and that they're very popular for aftermarket third-party plugins that people are buying. And those plugins, and I guess all plugins really, are designed to receive input at a certain level, meaning that they have an operating level. I think that's what they call it, right, Benny?
Yeah. Most of the time, yeah.
Nominal operating level, I think is what they say. And that is the signal level that you're meant to hit the plugin with so that it responds the way they intended. And that is a good practice. It'll generally do what you think it's going to do if you follow that rule. You can break that rule. I do all the time. But it's good to know what your gear is hoping to receive. So highly recommend checking out the manuals whenever you get new plugins and becoming familiar with how they're meant to be run.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a great plugin that I want to recommend right now that is, I think there's a free version, but even like the full version is very, very cheap, but it's awesome. It's called the VUMT by Klanghelm is the company.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I got that.
It's called VUMT, and there's a VUMT Deluxe as well. Some people just call it the VUMPT because that's how you can spell it. It's a VU meter. It's an emulation of an analog VU meter. Like you all know what that looks like, and if you don't, just Google it. You instantly know. And so what you can do with that meter is you can look at your signal, see how loud it is, and just to put it into perspective, how quiet things can be. If your compressor or analog emulation plugin says calibration like -18 or something, or operating level -18. And you put the same value into the VUMT, which is the default value actually, because it's the most common level for analog gear, then that means if that meter shows 0 on your channel strip in the DAW, you're actually having -18 RMS. So
right.
It's much quieter than many people run their signals. So many people will leave a couple of dB headrooms and then they'll hit an 1176. So they have the tracks at like -5 or 6 or whatever, and then they hit 1176, and it's gonna distort. Even if you're not compressing it, it's gonna distort because the plugin recreates what the analog unit sounds like. And if it's calibrated for like -18 and you're running it way too hot, it's gonna sound different. So with plugins like the VUMT, you can meter stuff, and if that plugin is at 0 and it has the same calibration as your plugin afterwards, then you know you're hitting it right. So that's what you basically can do. Many plugins have a VU meter built into them, but those that have not, you can use something like the VUMT by Klanghelm to just to monitor that.
Yeah, you can gauge it. Like this is a knowledge is power situation, because you'll learn what the plugin's meant to sound like by hitting it at its nominal optimal range, which, like Benny said, is normally -18. That's like a very safe. If you're too lazy to read the manual, guess on -18.
Yeah.
But then you learn that, and now you can start kind of breaking the rules as well.
Exactly.
Like 1176s, for example. I use the Universal Audio 1176 Blue Stripe all the time. It's a great plugin. And if you hit it hotter, it does a really pleasing distortion to me. And so that's something you can take advantage. I can be like, okay, it's going in like normal, and I want a little bit more of that dirt. I know how far I can push it and to increase that. So you can kind of manipulate the end result once you learn your gear and you kind of learn how it works.
I want to encourage you actually to do that and to go too far, because that's the only way you really find out the sweet spots. You find out how certain pieces of gear sound cool. And there are certain pieces of gear who are known for their quality when you hit them harder than usually.
Mm-hmm.
So same thing with like summing stuff. So if you are combining various tracks in your DAW, if you're sending all your, like, let's say the easiest possible scenario. So you have all the individual tracks in your DAW and you're sending them all to the master bus, to the master output. They all get summed together. The level will, they will add up. The level will increase. So the master bus will be hotter than any of the individual buses or individual channels. And as long as you don't go above 0, nothing bad will happen. As Malcolm said, probably you could even go beyond 0 with most DAWs because of 32-bit processing. You don't even clip the master out if it's in the red. But I still think you should try to do it as if it were an analog desk. I really like to encourage people to just treat it like an analog desk and try to avoid clipping the output, the master bus. And then what happens is if you put one of the mix bus emulations that are out there on there, or a mix bus compressor or something like that, there is the operating level again and the recommended range again that you should hit it. But many of these things, of these plugins, sound better actually if you hit them a little harder. So like everyone who has ever mixed on an SSL or certain pieces of analog gear, certain desks, they tend to sound cool when you push the mix bus a little harder. So that's not what they're meant to be used, like what they were meant to be, but it just works. It just adds harmonic distortion. It just does it in a pleasing way. So as long as nothing is on the master bus, it will probably just stay clean even if you clip it. But as soon as there is something like the Slate console emulation or the Brainworks console plugins or a mix bus compressor or anything like that, it starts to get interesting, and it absolutely matters how hot the individual faders are running into that bus.
Yeah, definitely.
So, and yeah, you need to try that, and you should try that. You should go too far, actually. You should destroy your signal from time to time in order to find out where the sweet spot is.
Yeah, definitely. There's been plugins that I just didn't see a reason for existing initially until I messed with them more, and then now I love them. Like there's a plugin called, we're mentioning a lot of plugins in this episode, but like Soundtoys Radiator. It's like kind of like a Altec preamp emulator, and I mean, like it's cool. The preamp, the EQ sections on it kind of cool, but I was like, okay, it's not really doing much for me. But then I started hitting it too hard, and I'm like, oh, I love this thing. I love what it does. It really grits it up, and yeah. So sometimes breaking the rules unlocks that plugin for you, and you'll discover a new use for it. But we should talk about how to manipulate the gain a little bit, so that people know what to do once they're in their DAW. Because obviously outside of the DAW, it is handled by your gain knobs, like on the gain on your preamp. And if you're using hardware, you have to be careful, because sometimes there's like, an in and an out on a compressor. So if you're coming out of the compressor too hot into something else, it's, you could still be clipping the next piece of gear. It actually gets more complicated the more pieces of gear you have in your signal chain. You have to be quite careful with that. Same with EQs. If you're boosting a whole ton of stuff with an EQ, that's adding level. So you might be slamming the compressor after it or whatever. So you have to be careful with there. But inside of the DAW, the best little like easy trick, especially with you're dealing with plugin chains, is to use like a trim plugin, which every DAW will have a trim plugin. But that's just a plugin that doesn't do anything sonically other than adjust the level. So you can turn it up or down as needed to compensate so that it's hitting the plugin after it correctly.
Yeah.
And a lot of plugins, especially nowadays, have that built into them, which is awesome as well. So if you open up like the stock EQ in Pro Tools and probably any plugin, there's probably an input and output gain knob on there. So by changing that, the input knob will change anything that happens before it hits the EQ, and the output will change anything after the EQ. So that you can, make sure you're coming in at the level you want and leaving at the level you want, which is also really handy for EQ or like for volume matching stuff as well.
That's what I was about to say, because one main benefit and one of the biggest benefits of proper gain staging, and why you should like just practice that and just make it like second nature to just do that and pay attention to that stuff, is that, and that's also why it's relevant to you when you record it, not just like when you mix, is when you are building tones, when you are trying out different signal chains, when you're committing plugins, whenever you are coloring your signal, processing your signal in any way, the only way to make an informed decision is comparing the before and after at the same volume, the same perceived volume. And you can only and the way to do that is proper gain staging. So you're hitting the plugin with the right amount of level so that it sounds the way you want. That's the first step. And then you are adjusting for the loss or the increase in gain that you get with that plugin so that you can bypass it and you hear the before and after at a similar volume, at least, as close as possible. Because if you are having, like, imagine you're recording a kick drum and you boost a bunch of lows to make it fuller, bigger, fatter, whatever, and then you boost a bunch of highs for the click, for the kick attack, and then you do a before and after, the process signal will be much louder and will sound way better to you. And unless you turn the gain down and compare it at similar volume, you don't really know if you made it better. Even more difficult with like guitars or like with a kick, it probably will be better if you do what I just described. but there are some things, or vocals or something, like whenever something gets louder, you will like it more, and proper gain staging helps you there. The VU meter that I mentioned, the plugin also has this trim knob in there, so you can meter and adjust the gain at the same time. Many plugins have those trimmers built in exactly, and yeah, you should just do that, because otherwise, the more you're building your chain and the more plugins you're stacking up, you will end up somewhere completely different with your levels than where you started, and it's getting really hard to compare, because if you bypass the whole chain in the end, you don't really know what caused the signal, the level change. So you should do that after every single plugin. Make sure you hit the next plugin accurately, and then compensate again. And you should do that all the way through the chain, so that when you bypass one of the plugins, you can always check what that specific plugin does.
Yes. Yeah, there's occasionally a plugin that'll have a auto gain kind of feature where if you do make a change, it compensates to keep the volume the same. Be careful with that. A lot of them don't work properly. But that should become a crucial part of your workflow. Whenever you're using a plugin, make sure that you gain match it. Level match, because you'll be totally blown away by what your ears think are better or is better, but it's just the volume difference. And once you volume match it, you'll discover that, oh, wow, that doesn't sound better at all. It can really trick you. So definitely do that.
Yes. Also, if you are recording with amp sims, for example, that's a very drastic case, but it's a pretty good example of what we're talking about here. If you're recording with amp sims and you're recording a DI guitar into the virtual guitar amp, gain staging is like everything, basically, because it's whether you turn up or down the gain knob on the amp or just increase the level going into the plugin, it's the same thing, basically. You're just sending more level into the amp. It will distort more or less. So that's a very clear example of what gain staging is and why it is so important. And it's, again, we said it in the amp sim episode, it's worth having a look at the manual of your amp sim at the calibration, because otherwise you don't even know how hot you should record your DI and like what the actual level should be so that the amp reacts like the real amp. Because if you hit it way too hot or way too quiet, then no wonder you're thinking the amp sim is different. It's like you need to hit it right in order for it to behave like the input on your real amp.
Yes.
One thing that I wanna tell people is that you should learn the stuff that we left out in this episode, the very technical stuff, like the different dB scales, like the conversion from one to another, stuff like that. It's worth knowing at least the basics of that stuff, and it's easier to read that stuff up and just over and over again until you remember it and you really know it. But it's worth doing that, just that you understand the terms, just so you can actually read and understand the manuals. And then stuff like knowing that, for example, whenever you sum two signals together, it will get louder if the signals have overlapping like frequency content. And one practical example here, and that also falls into the category of gain staging, is whenever you are sending a stereo source into a mono bus, or if you are converting a stereo channel to a mono channel, or exporting a stereo channel as a mono track, which often happens when people send me stuff. So they will record something as stereo, but it is actually a mono track. They just forgot to hit the mono button, and they recorded to a stereo track because that was the default configuration of the DAW, for example. And then they exported in mono. Sorry?
It's Logic. We're talking about Logic.
Yes.
Logic is the worst for this.
Yes, exactly, totally. So everything will be stereo by default. People just don't change it. They record stereo tracks for everything. The vocal will be stereo track. The kick drum will be a stereo track. But obviously, those are just mono sources. So a stereo track of those will be just the same thing left and right. So when you export that stuff and send it to Mixer, for example, and you export it in mono, you have half the file size, you have all the information, but half the file size, so you should do that. But you got to be careful when you do that. You're adding an extra 3 or 6 dB of gain, depending on pan law and settings in your DAW, but usually it's an extra 3 dB of gain when you combine two identical signals to mono. So that means if you only have 2 dB of headroom until 0 in your stereo track, and you export that as mono, you will clip the resulting mono file by 1 dB. And I have that often that people will send me stuff and I will say, hey, listen, like these tracks are clipping. And they are like, no, I'm looking at my session. They're not clipping. And then like we both are right when we're saying this, the errors in between, it happens during the export. So just learning these gain staging principles, how adding signals work, the different, scales, the different metering tools that are out there. It's just very handy basic knowledge that will help you improve your craft. And it's hard to explain stuff like that on a podcast, but we just wanted you to know that it's super important, even though it seems boring, but it is worth knowing this stuff, really.
Definitely.
Okay. Any other examples that you can think of?
Yeah. I think the last thing, which is suiting because it is the last part of the whole thing, is that your master bus, like you have to be watching that as well and making sure that you're not clipping at the end of it, because your master bus is where everything's headed and it's what's going to play out the speakers, right? So you don't want to be slamming that. Leave some headroom there as well. Doesn't have to be a lot, just has to be some. That's really all you need to know about that. I've had some people send me tracks for mastering that are clipping, and it's like, well, you just got to back it all down. I need that room. Yeah. And so, keep an eye on your master fader. Just because we talked about Logic, I want to call attention to that. For whatever reason, Logic seems to default to everything being a stereo file, even though it's not. And then also, I think the default setting on Logic export or bounces is to limit it, or to normalize it, actually.
Oh, yeah.
Not limit it, but to normalize it, which should not be selected.
Nope.
That's off topic, but well, kinda. It's gain. But essentially, Logic users, please learn about that stuff. It's so frustrating.
Yes.
It's like the Google Drives of DAWs.
Yeah, in a way. Yeah. Good thing you bring that up, because we've been mentioning a couple of times that you cannot clip within your DAW. You can very well clip at the end of the DAW, at the output.
Yes.
You cannot clip at the input of the master, although we highly recommend you don't clip that as well, just as a good practice. Just make sure you don't clip any bus unless it's intentional. But at the output of the master bus, you definitely don't want to clip that totally. But also, there's some misinformation out there, and you'll know that as a mastering engineer, of course, Malcolm, that people will say or will believe that there's a certain amount of headroom that they should leave at the end because that's what you're supposed to send to mastering or whatever. The thing is, the misinformation here is, digital gain is digital gain, and it's like clean. You can add 5 or 6 dB. You can take away 5 or 6 dB. It does not do anything to the sound. So as long as the master out is not clipping, and you send something somewhere, the person receiving it can always turn it down a little if they need more headroom because of their plugins or gear or whatever. And if they tell you they want a certain amount of headroom, then just do it. But just know that there's nothing wrong with your signal as long as it's below 0. So there's no sonic difference between minus 0.1 and minus 10.
Yeah.
So
the only difference because some people think there is a difference because they can hear it. And the difference is actually in your monitor controller at that point.
Yes.
You are turning up your monitor feed on your maybe cheap interface, and it's having a harder time sending that out. That's where the difference comes, is in those kind of things. It's not, but in the actual digital file, there's no difference. So yeah, not a problem. You can be loud or quiet, just don't clip.
Yeah, unless it's intentional, because as we've learned,
Yes.
it's okay to break all the rules we just told you if you
Yep.
do it intentional.
That distorted part of my voice in this podcast where I cranked up my preamp, I use that as a guitar tone every once in a while. I just completely pin the preamp and it sounds super fuzzy and awesome. And so you can do it.
Totally. This might be an episode where if you have any more questions or if anything's unclear what we've been talking about, because it is kind of an abstract, like weird topic to talk about, especially when you're just starting out. So if you have any more questions there, any follow-up questions, I post every episode of this podcast in our Facebook group on, it's just Self-Recording Band community on Facebook. You can easily find that. By the way, the direct link is the selfrecordingband.com/community. That will forward you to the Facebook group. And you can I post every episode in there and just start a thread below this post. Like, just put your follow-up questions there. Let's start a discussion. If anything's unclear of all the things we've just tried to describe and explain, just put your question there. We'll jump in and answer. Maybe some other people will jump in. And just know that these threads are also serve for you as an opportunity to post follow-up questions and get into more details or things that we might have missed in this episode.
Totally. All right. Thank you for listening.
See you next week. Bye.